In movies and illustrations, people often romanticize the luxurious rooms inside castles. The grand hall with its soaring ceilings, the Lord's chamber glowing with warm firelight, or the council room where the fate of an entire land was decided. But that's just a modern illusion. If you stepped into a real medieval castle, it would take only a few minutes to realize a surprising truth almost no one expects. The most important room wasn't where the Lord sat, it was the kitchen. Sounds ordinary? Not at all. In an age when winter could kill faster than war, the kitchen was the beating heart of the castle. The fire wasn't just for cooking, it kept everyone alive. It produced warmth, light, hot water, and served as a signal that this castle is still alive. If the fire died, if the kitchen stopped working, the entire castle would slip into darkness and a cold so brutal no one could stay inside. Even more fascinating, every daily rhythm in the castle wake-up time, how people lived, even the layout of the rooms was shaped by the kitchen. It was the first place to wake up, the last to sleep, and the only space that kept the castle's heartbeat going day and night. And from here, countless secrets of medieval life begin to unfold. Because once you understand the true role of the kitchen, you understand how the entire castle worked. If there was one place in a castle that could overwhelm you the moment you stepped in, it was the kitchen. This wasn't the cute little cooking room you see in movies. It was a massive space with towering vaulted ceilings, built not for beauty but out of necessity. Medieval people knew one thing very well. If the ceiling were even a little lower, the entire room would turn into a box of smoke, and anyone working inside could suffocate before the food was even halfway done. But the most striking feature was the enormous hearth so large they could roast several whole animals at once. These weren't simple campfires. They were complex engineering structures made of giant stones and reinforced with metal to withstand constant, unending heat. Their fires could burn day and night, season after season, without weakening. What most people don't know is that these hearths were essentially the industrial machines of the Middle Ages. They were carefully designed to run continuously. The fire could not be allowed to die, the heat could not drop, and no interruption was acceptable in the rhythm of the entire castle. In other words, if the kitchen was the heart, then these fire pits were the engines that never stopped. In most people's imagination, the castle kitchen is just a secondary room, a place for servants to cook while the nobles handle important matters. But here comes the twist that surprises almost everyone. The kitchen was not a secondary room. Its placement was calculated with the same strategic importance as a military structure. Medieval castle builders weren't just good at war, they were masters of practical observation. They understood something we rarely think about today. Cold food might be embarrassing, but lost heat was deadly. That's why the kitchen was never placed randomly. It was always positioned at the very core of the castle, next to the Great Hall, next to the dining room, sometimes even next to the Lord's private chambers. And the real reason wasn't faster food delivery, it was to make use of an invisible resource, heat. The enormous kitchen fire burned day and night, producing a massive amount of warmth. Instead of letting it escape, medieval architects did something modern engineers would admire. They turned the kitchen into a primitive central heating system, allowing heat to spread through the stone walls and warm the surrounding rooms. The closer your room was to the kitchen, the warmer it was. The farther you were, the colder, sometimes so cold it was nearly impossible to survive the winter there. And just like that, heat became a measurement of status. That's why the location of the kitchen didn't just determine survival, it silently determined who mattered most inside the castle. If this twist surprised you, or if you'd like to hear more about the heat map inside medieval castles, drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts from a modern perspective. One thing most people don't know is that medieval castles didn't just have floor plans or defense maps. They also had something invisible, but far more powerful, a heat map. This map wasn't drawn on paper, yet it determined exactly who got to live in warmth and who had to endure freezing nights. And it all began with the location of the kitchen. When the massive hearths burned day and night, the heat didn't stay inside the kitchen. It traveled through stone walls, spiral staircases, and narrow corridors, slowly seeping into the rooms above. The thick stone walls acted like giant thermal batteries, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it little by little at night, keeping bedrooms from turning into freezers. The result was simple. Rooms directly above or beside the kitchen were the warmest and most livable. The farther the room, the higher, the more exposed, the more drafty, the colder it became. In some rooms, the cold was so brutal that water could literally freeze in the basin. Here's the fascinating part. Medieval people didn't need a social diagram to show hierarchy. Temperature did the job for them. Warmest rooms, the lord, the lady, their children, and honored guests. Moderate rooms, officials and high-ranking servants. Coldest, farthest rooms, guards, low-ranking servants, and anyone considered unimportant. In other words, the more powerful you were, the closer you slept to the fire. The lower your status, the farther you were pushed from its warmth. And that's how something as simple as kitchen heat quietly shaped the entire social structure inside a medieval castle. To keep those massive castle hearths burning day and night, medieval people paid a steep price. Keeping the kitchen running wasn't a matter of tossing in a few bundles of firewood. It was a survival battle that demanded labor, muscle, animal power, and a resource management system almost on the scale of a primitive industry. A large castle hearth could devour tons of wood every week, enough to burn through a small forest in just a few months. Historians estimate that keeping a major castle's kitchen running for a single year required several thousand cubic meters of timber, the equivalent of cutting down and hauling an entire woodland. Because of that, the work of preparing firewood never stopped. Summer, autumn, winter, rainy season, there was always cutting, hauling, stacking, and drying to be done. Woodcutters worked deep in the forest, chopping trees from dawn to dusk. Forest managers oversaw planting and cutting to prevent the wood supply from collapsing. Horses, oxen, wooden carts, and winter sledges dragged heavy logs back to the castle. Servants stacked the wood into huge piles, dried it, then fed the kitchen constantly without pause. One long rainstorm, one brutal winter, or even a delayed shipment, and the castle's fire could weaken, which meant losing heat, losing light, losing food, and ultimately losing the ability to survive. Keeping the fire alive was one of the hardest and most essential duties in the entire castle. If you think a new day in a medieval castle began with trumpets or the footsteps of guards, that's a charming misconception. In reality, everything started with a quiet ritual performed in darkness, a ritual almost no one outside the servant class ever witnessed. They called it the waking of the fire. Long before the sky even hinted at dawn, when the cold still clung thickly to the stone walls, the youngest servants rose in. Silence. They slipped into the kitchen, the only sound being the soft crunch of ash beneath their feet. The fire from the night before was never allowed to die completely. It slept under a heavy blanket of gray ash, like a creature at rest, and it was their job to awaken it. They gently stirred the ash, revealing deep red embers glowing like half-open eyes. Then, using a large animal skin bellows, they forced a strong breath of air into the hearth. Within seconds, the coals flared bright and alive, the fire leapt up like a freed beast, and the first warmth of the day spread across the kitchen. At that moment, the lower-ranked cooks arrived, tossing in the smallest pieces of wood, then larger logs. Flames rose high, reflecting off copper pots, iron pans, and roasting spits. And only then did the castle truly wake up. The smell of bread, the hiss of boiling water, the chop of knives, the rush of people preparing the day's first meal. From morning until night, the kitchen worked like a restless beehive, and when darkness returned, the opposite ritual took place. The fire was put to sleep, banked under ash so it could survive until dawn. Historians believe this rhythm, waking the fire and putting it to rest, shaped the daily life of entire castles for centuries. If this ritual feels almost mythical to you, leave a comment. I'd love to hear how you imagine that scene. In a medieval castle that was always cold, damp, dusty, and full of disease risks, there was something more precious than food.
Hurry now,
hot water.
the master is waiting.
And surprisingly, the kitchen, a place most people assume was only for cooking, was actually the castle's only and most important source of hot water. Right beside the massive hearths, large cast iron cauldrons were kept simmering all day long. Because of this, the kitchen became the only place capable of producing something incredibly rare for the time. Water hot enough for washing, cleaning, and maintaining even the most basic hygiene. Without hot water from the kitchen, greasy dishes would never truly be clean. Clothes and bedding couldn't be rid of lice. Food was far more likely to become contaminated. Diseases spread through the mouth and skin could erupt at any moment. And in a world without modern medicine, even a small outbreak inside a castle could wipe out the entire community within weeks. Beyond that, hot water from the kitchen was essential for the mandatory hand-washing ritual before meals, especially among the nobility. Servants carried warm, herb-infused water to each person. This wasn't just etiquette, it was the only real protection against intestinal diseases in a world without antibiotics. In other words, the medieval kitchen was the boiler room, plus sanitation station, plus disease prevention center all merged into one. Without it, the entire castle would be swallowed by filth, sickness, and danger. When night fell over a medieval castle, everything sank into cold darkness. There was no electricity, candles were expensive, and torches were dangerous. In those days, light was a luxury, something only the most essential places could afford to maintain. Yet there was one room that never went dark: the kitchen. The great fire that burned constantly inside created a living light, bright, warm, and steady, spilling through doorways and corridors like a quiet stream of flame. Night workers, patrolling guards, and servants carrying supplies all relied on that glow so they wouldn't slip on spiral staircases, crash into stone walls, or get lost in the narrow, twisting passages. In an age where one misstep could break a bone and a fallen candle could burn down an entire stronghold, the glow from the kitchen was like a lighthouse inside the fortress. But the light didn't just help people see. The heat from the hearth evaporated moisture in the room, keeping wooden beams and stored herbs from molding. In that hot, dry airflow, people hung onions, garlic, herbs, even meat to dry, squeezing every practical benefit they could from the only fire that never slept. In other words, the kitchen didn't just cook, it was the castle's light, warmth, and safety. And in the medieval world, power wasn't defined only by armies or walls. There was something else, something that made enemies hesitate and allies admire. The kitchen. It sounds strange, but in those days, a glimpse of a castle's kitchen told you instantly how powerful its lord truly was. The massive kitchens with roasting pits big enough to turn an entire cow and dozens of pots of soup boiling over the same fire were declarations of strength. They proved that the Lord wasn't just ruling, he could feed hundreds of people, day after day, month after month. It was a kind of soft power everyone understood, even without a single word spoken. In fact, welcoming an important guest came with its own special ritual, taking them to see the kitchen, not to show off recipes, but to show off economic muscle. A kitchen that was busy, clean, organized, and staffed with dozens of servants moving like a giant well-oiled machine was living proof that the castle was wealthy, powerful, stable, and unafraid of scarcity. But if the kitchen looked chaotic, low on firewood, short on food, with too few workers, a single glance told visitors everything. The Lord was weak, mismanaged, or even facing a crisis. In other words, the kitchen was the most honest test of leadership. In an age when words were cheap, the fire in the kitchen was the one thing that never lied. If you've made it this far, you've probably felt it too. The kitchen wasn't just where meals were cooked, it was the living soul beating at the heart of every medieval castle. But there's still one more detail people often overlook. In a world where riots, winter storms, disease, or war could strike without warning, every room in the castle could fall silent, dark, or empty, except the kitchen. The kitchen fire was the one thing that could never be allowed to die, not on holidays, not on ordinary days, not even during a siege. It was the sign that the castle was still alive, its lord was still standing, and everyone inside still had their last thread of hope. Without that flame, a castle, no matter how strong, was just a cold block of stone waiting to collapse. That's why when you stood in the courtyard, or looked from afar, and saw the kitchen smoke rising steadily into the sky, you knew the people inside were not defeated, not broken, not falling into chaos. The kitchen fire was the castle's heartbeat, and as long as it burned, life continued. Now it's your turn. Among everything you've just heard, what surprised or fascinated you the most? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy history told in a vivid, human, cinematic way like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. There are still so many hidden secrets of the past waiting to be uncovered.